Welcome to episode 133 of Silver Lining for Learning. This is our last episode for this year. So we'll wish you a Happy New Year at the end of the show. But when we started Silver Lining back in March 2020, it was, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and everything seemed a bit chaotic and crazy. One of the things that we wondered about is what could emerge from this crisis, especially in education. So we ended up calling it Silver Lining for Learning, not Pandemic Ponderings, because if we would have called it that, this show would have been over a long time back. So you will continue today. The other thing that we celebrate is Kurt Bonk decided to start running around the same time. And as of this week, he has run 1,000 days in a row. So that's the t-shirt.
Not around 1,000 days. It's not around March. It was the same day as the show started.
Same
the exact
day
same day. Actually, an hour before the show started. So I've been going every day since. Thank you, COVID.
So, we have a run. Kurt's been running. So it's been great. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have two leaders from the Center for Reinventing Public Education, SREPI for short, with us today. Robin Lake, the director, and Travis Pillow, who's an innovation fellow and senior writer. And Robin, as I was looking up the titles, I felt he had a cooler title than you did.
I know.
I'd rather be innovation fellow than be director.
Director of all things great.
Right. And, part of the excitement is the work that SREPI has been doing, but also as of February this year, they are now colleagues of mine formally. SREPI is now part of the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and it has been incredibly fun and productive working together to get to know you guys, bring our faculty and our grad students together, and actually got to meet up face-to-face a couple of weeks ago, which was great. In short, one of the reasons why SREPI is such a great organization to bring on the show is because they research classrooms, schools, and systems, and particularly have focused during the COVID time, have become really a go-to site for the kinds of work that they have done, which has, critical for educators and others hoping to build a better educational future. And they have amazing sort of reports that you can find on their website, crpe.org, around tracking pandemic data, about learning innovations, the profile of the learner, and so on. So there's a lot to discuss. So I will shut up. And without further ado, Robin, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go to Travis. And then, maybe after that, a little bit about SREPI and the work that you do, and we'll just open it up from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Punyan, all. It's really, really, really fun to join you. And we are thrilled to be part of ASU and the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. It's been nothing but just stimulating and really lovely connections and new ideas for us. So we are excited about that. And so a little bit about me. Well, I have a kind of a boring story, and that has been staying at the center since 1993, believe it or not. So we are almost 30 years old at the center. And so I was, 1 year old when I started. But I've been plugging away there because it's been such fascinating work, really. I joined our founder, Paul Hill, started the center to just think about really what gets in the way of schools being effective, innovative, equitable at scale. And what are the system constraints and how can we change them up? And he had this really compelling tagline that I love coming back to over and over again. He said, public education is a goal, not a particular set of institutions. The goal is to do what's right by kids for our public purpose, but we can't be bound up by the types of institutions that we've built, hundreds of years ago for that purpose. And so we do research and policy work. We try to, think outside of the boundaries of what people have imagined is possible. And, I've studied all kinds of innovative school models, personalized learning, charter schools, and school system reforms across a lot of urban systems. And that was pre-pandemic, and I'll hold there and shift over to Travis, and then we'll kind of come back to what we've been up to since the pandemic and where we're going.
Thanks, Robin. Travis, go ahead.
So thank you all for having us. And my name's Travis Pillow. I'm joining you all from Central Florida. I'm an innovation fellow and senior writer at SREPI. And I got my start here in Florida as a journalist, actually covering politics and eventually education policy. And then started working on school choice policy and writing here around in the state. And I worked on the team that helped set up the nation's second education savings account program that provides individualized funding to families, particularly for students with special needs. And it was that work that really formed the basis of some of my first conversations with Robin, where we were starting to think about what can we learn from the efforts to customize learning for some of the most complex learners with some of the most complex needs. And also, what are some of the things maybe happening outside of the public education system that we can study, that we can learn from, that we can start to ask questions around what can they tell us about system change, and how do we start to reconcile the idea of individualized learning with some of what Robin was talking about around the fact that the idea of public education matters, that yes, we need to individualize learning for all students, and we need to have common goals around preparing all students for a life of thriving as adults and as citizens. And so that is where we find a lot of that forms those questions form the basis for a lot of my work at SREPI.
So
thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Robin.
Well, I'll just say one thing that Travis just teed up for us is before we talk about kind of what we've been doing during the pandemic. I think an important thing for us at SREPI in our commitment to continue to challenge our own thinking and not become an institution ourselves, we, for our 25th anniversary, put out a series of papers. We wanted to not just look back on what we accomplished as a center, but we wanted to look forward. Where is the world headed? Where is the economy headed? What are the jobs of the future? What is the role of technology and AI going to mean for our requirements for educating students to be able to participate? Where is inequity headed? What are civic dynamics likely to be? So we did a lot of exploration in that area, and we tried to think about, well, where does that take us in terms of how we define the goals of learning, what students need to be able to do and know before they graduate. We started exploring ideas like Travis was talking about complex learners. We thought, well, maybe we should start designing education for the most complex kids. And in the course of that, all kids will benefit through personalized learning. Maybe we should think about rethinking high school and making a more permeable relationship between high school, college, and career, because that's going to be important. We were just really playing and exploring, and then we were also looking at sort of the prior reform efforts in education and saying, okay, not good enough, not nearly good enough. Where might we go? And so I think you're going to ask me about kind of our pandemic work. So I'll turn it back to you, Punya. But I just wanted to give that as context because it really is important to how we thought about the moment when the pandemic hit.
Perfect. That's a perfect kickoff to, I think, the first question. And I know that, you guys have done a lot. We will talk, I think, later towards sort of what we're thinking of for the future. But one of the things that started the show was this idea that maybe there is an opportunity here with the pandemic, with the disruptions caused by that, to think about education in new ways, which was sort of really the original email that Zhao sent to us. I blame him for the fact that the pandemic went on that long, because he said, what if schools were closed for a year? And at that point, we were thinking Kurt would run for 5 days and the show would be over in 2 weeks. But here we are, right? And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about sort of your work around sort of this pandemic data that you've been tracking. And particularly, I think you've been looking at like 100 large urban and districts that serve nearly 100 million students, as I see from your website. So what were some of the things that you learned from that? What were characteristics of school systems that worked? What were ones that didn't? What kinds of sort of innovations you see that you think will continue? or sort of were useful at that time, and so on. So either of you can start us off, and then I think we'll just open it up to Q&A from the other hosts.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Why don't I start with basics, and on innovations, I want to hand it over to Travis. Okay, so March 2020, we're in Seattle, and so we were looking around and talking to some of our friends who ran school systems and seeing what was going on. And of course, we didn't know either how long anything would last, but we thought, okay, this is going to be bad. We've been around the block with public education. We knew that it's a lot of great things, but nimble it is not. And we thought, we also knew that when one size fits all in public education, the most vulnerable students lose out. So we were concerned. So our response was, let's try to be as helpful as possible. Let's gather data where we can. We'll look across, the 100 largest districts, and we started rolling out on, who's open when, who's closing, what are they offering? And it wasn't looking good for a long time. And so a lot of our news was very, very bad and alarming. We were looking at the types of offerings that school districts were putting out, how quick they were to offer some kind of virtual instruction, how good that virtual instruction looked, were kids getting access to live teachers and that kind of thing. It was really basic stuff. And over time, we got, more and more complex, where we were gathering data on what kinds of supports students and teachers were being offered, and, all kinds of things. The big news, I guess, is we were really, really worried that kids were going to lose out a lot, and based on what we were seeing, and that the most vulnerable students would, and that teachers were struggling in the process. And so I think we were getting louder and louder in our calls for, we need to stop being complacent and stop being in denial and get serious about shifting and innovating and meeting kids' needs. And then we started also, the other thing that we did, besides just kind of tracking the alarming stuff, was we wanted to track the bright spots and understand where there were folks who were responding effectively. And I would say, leadership really mattered during the pandemic. And in particular, leadership always matters, but, great leaders kind of found a way. And especially if they had decent relationships and trust with their educators, that was really helpful in turning on a dime. But some actually got really creative and were producing really amazing ideas. Having teachers specialize, for example, in virtual learning, saying, well, we've got a master teacher who's really good at lecturing. Let's have them lecture in large groups, and then have teachers that are great at small group instruction do that. And well, why didn't we think of that a long time ago? But here we are. So, we just amassed information, and then, more recently, we've been turning to, well, what do we know at this point? So we've organized researchers to get the best brains around the toughest questions. What do we know about the academic impacts on kids at this point? What do we know about the mental health impacts? What do we know about students with disabilities? Oftentimes the answer has been not all that much, and we're just calling that out. And now we're going to have the opportunity, thanks to a new grant that we've got, to commission some research in needed areas. So I would say we've tried to, bottom line is, be sense makers during this period and watch for the things that we have always known are rigidities in the system, in ways that the most vulnerable kids will fall farthest behind. And, I don't know if we want to talk about some of those results at some point, but, we're in a pretty critical time right now. And so we're sort of turning toward, how can we be most helpful in recovery? And I'll hand it over to Travis, because the other part that we're trying to be really helpful in is reimagining. And so I'll just set you up, Travis, by saying, I think that the prior work we had done for our 25th anniversary papers around unbundling learning and rebundling it really, for us, when we thought about parents and teachers going offline, off the grid, going into their homes, into, yards and pods and things to just create their own education, we thought, wow, this is going to be a really critical opportunity to just watch for the revealed preferences of families and educators to understand what do they choose in a time when anything is on the table. So Travis, you want to talk about our pods work?
Sure. So, and I think we've been thinking back a lot about the early days of the pandemic, and I want to go back to the summer of 2020 when there was that moment of optimism that maybe schools would reopen in the fall. I think that was one of the themes that we saw from tracking districts, was that, every couple of months, it seemed like there was this moment where everyone was sort of hoping that the return to normal was just around the corner. And then that return to normal never came, or wound up being uprooted by another wave of COVID cases. And so I remember that, we remember that moment when that was happening in summer of 2020. There was this sudden surge in interest in families forming their own pods. And we at SREPI immediately sort of started having bells ringing around, first of all, there's an equity question around what families are going to have the ability to set this thing up. Are systems going to set this kind of support up so that all students can benefit, or is this going to become sort of a luxury good? But then the second thing, kind of along the lines of what Robin was saying, is what can we learn about what happens when families and communities start to take learning into their own hands? And so that was our jumping off point. And so we started interviewing families who were setting these things up. We started interviewing teachers who were employed in learning pods. And we also started casting across the country, finding dozens of places where community organizations, groups that were maybe formerly known as out of school time providers, started setting up new learning environments, really a lot of times just with weeks of planning. And so one of the things that we saw was that some of these organizations, like the Boston Community Learning Collaborative in New England, or the African Leadership Group in Colorado, they had maybe connections to a specific segment of their community that they were able to serve and cater to in ways that had never been possible before schools shut down. And suddenly there was this void in where the school day had been, that these groups were able to step into and maybe rethink the types of programming and support that students receive. We also saw all this new sort of energy coming off the sidelines. There was one pod that is a memorable one, was called Grandmommy University, where basically a group of retired teachers came out of retirement in rural Tennessee to set up like a much more small group based individualized learning experience for a group of their grandkids. And then, it sort of snowballed from there. And one thing that we saw in a lot of this work was that basically 4 out of 5 pods that we studied relied on some form of online learning. And then most of them did some sort of customization on top of that. But so what that really showed us was that it's possible to sort of unbundle what we normally have sort of boxed into a single teacher role. And so if students are accessing their pedagogical expertise or their content virtually, you're suddenly unlocking this new set of people, whether it's family members, whether it's maybe people in the community who care about kids but don't have a formal teacher background, who can then work with kids who don't have that necessarily content expertise or pedagogical background, but maybe have a strong, trusting relationship, maybe have the ability to run a woodworking program or something else that's just not part of a normal school curriculum. What can they bring to the table? How can they maybe connect with a student and help motivate them? So there are now a growing number of providers or learning environments that are thinking post-pandemic, how do we take some of these things we learned and extend them? So we have, these living room schools that are popping up all over Arizona that are using the Prenda model. We have companies like Kai Pods that are really designed to think about how do we maybe hire people who can play this new sort of support learning coach role for students who are accessing their learning online. And how can we maybe deliver just much more individualized learning experiences for students by tapping the talents of adults who might have never previously thought of themselves as a teacher. And so part of what we're doing now is we're starting to study some of these models. And one of the things we will hope to learn is what can this tell us about maybe redesigning teacher jobs, not just in some of these off the grid or out of system learning environments, but also in the system as a whole.
So this is actually quite exciting. December is a very strange month. That's the month when China first discovered this thing, and China is still struggling with this thing, this right now. At this moment, China is 3 years. And when I started this show, when I invited these guys to say, let's do a show, the reason I was doing that was to say, if schools were to be closed for a year, was that long enough to produce big changes? I think when Robin talked a lot about the kind of disastrous, things we've observed, these poor kids, you talk about learning loss. And now, Travis, you're talking about the new things that emerge out of this. And schools have gone through a lot. They've lost staff, a lot of school leader changes, a lot of students. We also see news. Parents are not, necessarily sending their kids. They're doing more homeschooling, online learning, all of those kind of things. It's been around a long time, and then we try to recover from learning loss, or maybe some people say there's learning gains, it's all kind of things. So my question, Rainey, to Robin and Travis, both of you, is because you guys are really doing this research on public education. So my first question, actually my only question is that, have you seen truly significant changes in our schools? Because from where I see everything, I don't. When schools rushed back, saying, let's cut off, virtual learning, let's do face-to-face, everything. And then, so do you see on the whole, American public education is moving towards something different, something better, or are we basically returning to pre-pandemic? Post-pandemic is pre-pandemic. Robin, Travis, any one of you? Thank you.
Yeah. We all were wringing our hands thinking, is there just going to be a rush back to normal? Everybody was like, oh, so many possibilities, so much greatness. We've rushed back to normal for sure. And one of my friends observed that, in times of crisis, people hold on to what they know. I think that's really been true. And we've seen that certainly in most of our public schools and school systems. And I was talking to a school principal in California, I don't know, a year or so ago, and I was telling him about all the stuff we've learned about pods and small learning communities and micro schools. And, he was game. He said, this is great. This is exactly what we think we need to be doing to, have better relationships with our kids and better know what they need and address their needs. But he said, I got to tell you, this is a self-sealing inertia. We are dealing with so much stuff coming at us, whether it's it's changed all the time through the course of the pandemic. I mean, when it was back to school time, they were dealing with mask policies and distances and barriers and now they're dealing with staffing shortages and burnout and the incredible complexity of need that students are bringing in the door. Every student had a different pandemic learning experience at home in their own personal lives and in the type of school that they were in or whatever. And so schools are like emergency rooms right now, dealing with this huge influx of need coming at them. And they are just holding fast to the steering wheel, trying to just do what they know and do it as well as they can. I mean, I think there's a lot of great intention out there. I want to make sure we acknowledge that people care, but the way that we've structured our systems, they can't get purchase on it. And we're seeing that in the data. Like, look, we've had historic drops in test scores, right? It's not good. We're not catching up. We're not catching kids up. Some kids are catching up because they're getting, a lot of support at home, or they're, they didn't fall that far behind in the first place. But we have a serious problem on our hands, in that school districts have ambitious goals, but because of these rigidities that they're holding fast to, it's not working. So we have to pivot. I will say on the more, well, I'll let maybe Travis be the more optimistic. there is optimism. And I think, well, for me, I don't know what you think, Travis, but for me, I do think there's a shift in people's thinking about what matters in public education and education in general. What matters in education, how we measure it. There's a lot of thought and discussion going into that. There is more interest than I've ever seen at rethinking how we approach personalizing education for kids. And the last bit that I'm really optimistic about is there, and this is a sort of a plug for Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, I guess, but there really is important work going on this front. The kids are not okay, but the adults have not been okay either, because of the way that we've set up this crazy system of, one teacher, 30 kids, good luck, do the best you can with all their complex needs. People are really game to rethink that. And the Next Education Workforce Initiative at Mary Lou Fulton, which we're just observing and getting to know, but they're doing great work to think about how can we change that up? How can we have teachers work in teams and specialize and do things really differently? Maybe have community educators come in. We work with a group in Oakland called the Oakland Reach that's training up a group of almost 100 parents to be tutors in Oakland public schools. That's going to be good for the teachers and the kids and the parents, because they're going to learn how to be better advocates for their kids. They'll make some money in the process. So there's new stuff emerging. There are new models out there, but I think, I don't know, Travis, would you agree? The new models that are most exciting, most out of the box, most out there are outside the public education system. And I think the work is, how do we watch that, as we're trying to do, and then bring the lessons into to more traditional systems.
Before Travis, you jump in, just for viewers, we had our Dean, Carol Basile, on the show, talking, of course, as she does, about the next education workforce. We had Brent Madden and one of the school principals from here on the show as well. And then speaking to the point about some of the interesting work happening outside of the public system, we had a whole series of episodes on India, which were all people who were in the NGO space, who were doing incredibly exciting work. So I think all of those points sort of bear out some of our experiences in the show as well. So Travis, go ahead, please.
Sure. So, and when I think about the question that Young teed up, I actually think about my own career as a journalist, and there was a time when I was covering the State House in Tallahassee, Florida, and most of my job was to run around and stick a microphone in the face of people in business attire and ask them about bills that were passing. And suddenly we got word from the higher ups that, the business is moving online, the daily newspaper, this bundle of paper that lands on your doorstep every morning, that's not where our future is. We're all going to have to do video. And so, if you look me up online, you'll probably find some pretty embarrassing, like pretty horrible looking videos that I was filming on deadline of standing in the Florida Capitol, poor audio, voice reverberating off the marble walls, of just these half-baked videos that we were doing because we knew that video was where the revenue was going to be. And it was just, rather than take a step back and think about how do we actually do this differently? What is an online business that's going to be, effective for news? How do we seize on the opportunity that digital content provides? We just started taking online video and making that one more thing that we did on top of everything else we were already doing. And so when I hear about teachers who are burnt out, when I hear about, the idea that in addition to everything else we're doing, now we also have to do learning acceleration. Now we also have to do tutoring. Now we also have to do, social emotional learning. All these things become one more thing one more demand that we're placing on teachers, rather than designing new routines, new processes, new ways of working that could actually meet the needs of students better and be more sustainable. So my former employer in the news business is, announcing layoff after layoff. Like, we did not solve our structural problems, but we can look at other organizations like the New York Times. They did create new business models. I'm sure that we've got some Wordle addicts or some spelling bee addicts or some people who maybe, half the food that I put on my table is something that I got from the cooking app, where they thought, how do we think differently about a business model? How do we transition to becoming a digital subscription business? And so over the course of the past decade, they went from making basically $4 out of $5 from the bundle of dead trees that landed on people's doorsteps every morning to making $4 to $5 from digital subscriptions. I think that there's an analogy in education about where are we seeing the opportunities to really experiment with wholly new business models. A lot of that's happening outside of the public system, but then some of it could be happening inside of districts that are creating, I know you all had Michael Horn on a few episodes ago. He talks a lot about creating autonomous units where educators have the freedom to kind of think in the way that the New York Times did, of what are new ways of doing business that allow us to do something new and better and more effective using the tools that are at our disposal. I think that one thing that gives me a lot of hope is just the fact that when we talk to superintendents, they talk about feeling addicted to the status quo and wanting to make a change. When we talk to teachers, we sense a groundswell of an idea that something needs to be done differently. Our colleagues at Mary Lou Fulton, there's kind of every layer of the system now. There's a recognition that we have to do things differently. And then I think the last thing that I'll say is just the idea that, a lot of our pandemic work, we saw, increased appreciation for the idea that relationships matter. How do we redesign learning experiences where students and teachers can build authentic working relationships that maybe last beyond a year? We saw things around the idea that learning can happen anytime, anywhere. We saw, to the point that I was making earlier, that our communities have lots of assets, lots of talent that they could be bringing to bear to support young people that has inadvertently been maybe pushed to the sidelines or walled off from school or walled off from the core learning experience. And so there's just this groundswell of realization that we can be doing something differently. And it's really a question of how do we carve out those opportunities for educators to kind of act on what they're really starting to see.
Thanks, Travis. I know Kurt has a question. Whenever, I love how enthusiastic you are. You're happy, this is, but whenever, you're talking about Florida, I just think you may want to go back to politics. That's where everything is happening, right? The Florida is the right place to be. I'm kind of disappointed that the public education is not getting better, is going back to normal. I think, Robin, I think your observation is quite consistent with mine. So I think Kurt has a question.
First, a comment. Florida is not the place to be, at least in my book. Now, Punya, you had a comment. You were trying to jump in. Do you want to comment?
Oh, no, I was just going to crack a joke about the New York Times model. So, the New York Times staff went on strike recently, and everybody who, people who would never cross the picket line, who would never, they were all for the workers. Guess what? The only thing they could not stop themselves from doing was stop their Wordle run. So they were going to the website still, so there is something to be said for finding a business model which gets addictive, so we need to crack that thing in education.
Yeah, we need to shift the addiction to the status quo to an addiction.
There you go. Anyway, so that was just my silly comment, as I tend to do. So Kurt, go ahead.
Well, Robin introduced herself as boring because she's been working there since 1993. And I just been taking a chance at refashioning my business card during the past half hour to say super boring, because I'm the one who's working in his current job the longest of any of us here today. I came in 1992. Chris went to Harvard in 2000. You are in 1993, and Young and Punya after that. So yeah, I'm the super boring one, I guess. But Young was talking about major changes during COVID. And given that Robin's been at SREPI for, it's her 30th year right now. And I wonder if both of you could provide us with some history lessons for people in terms of what were the big topics back in the early 90s that a center that's looking at reinventing publication were concerned about and making a dent, hopefully, in. And what are the big areas today, the key areas that people are focusing on? And maybe you could frame that discussion from the standpoint of how has the funding changed over the past 3 decades, and how do you track it? Could you provide some advice for the young people who might be listening to the show in the months to come, who might be looking to get similar kinds of grant monies? What foundations and sources are you tapping into? Are you tracking, and so forth? So perhaps a history lesson as well as some caveats and guidance for the people who might be listening in later.
Great. Well, Travis, do you want to take the first stab at that, or do you want me to?
So see, Robin wants to think about it. Yeah.
So Robin was 1 year old back when she started at SREPI. I must have been negative something. So it's interesting. All I know about that early work is what I know from talking to colleagues and reading the work that came out of that era. And I think what's so compelling to me about that history is the fact that, SREPI started with Paul Hill and a small group of committed individuals, of which Robin was one, really thinking about what does it look like to create coherent schools? How do you create schools where there's a strong organizational culture? We're all rallied around the same goals, and how do we create the conditions where that could happen? And Paul had observed that in some high performing Catholic schools, and he was kind of playing with different ideas around how do you make that possible in public education. And then in the decades that followed, things like charter schools started to come online. School districts started to think differently about how do we maybe give families more options. How do we and public school choice became a concept. And so so the sort of the trends have come and gone. But one thing that I take from that is that, when Paul was first playing with those ideas in the early 90s and even before then, a lot of what he was theorizing did not exist in the real world, or only existed in small, isolated pockets. And over time, the ideas started to snowball, and he got more and more different things to study, and was able to continually sort of think about, eventually, in the years that followed, sort of what does it look like to have coherent citywide strategies to manage all these new autonomous schools that are coming online, to make sure that no student falls through the cracks, to make sure that that there's options that are available to all families and not just those with the means to take advantage, and really thinking about those systemic factors. And I kind of think we're at a similar maybe place in the cycle now, where a lot of those ideas have sort of, to what Robin was saying earlier about what inspired SREPI's 25th anniversary, a lot of those ideas have maybe started to stall out politically. They've started the pushback has started to build. There's questions being raised about students who are still falling through the cracks. And so there's this hunger to start seeking out new ideas and start to think about, we're really early days in what could be some game-changing new innovations around like, what does the education workforce of the future look like? But and so thinking about like that and how can we kind of like consider ourselves like at a place where the playbook and the path forward are not clear. There's examples out there of people who are maybe building some of the kind of things that hint at a better future. How do we get out there and start to understand them? It makes it feel like it's an exciting time to be doing this work.
That's great. It's always good to have newer people try to kind of explain what we've been up to, and that's I'm sure a better explanation than I could have given. I will just add, I guess, that when I started at SREPI, the thing I had been doing before was I was working for the Washington State Legislature, and the conversations that were going in on the Education Committee and among people who were getting concerned about public education, the governor, the business community, were driven by the reports that were coming in. There was one in particular that some of you might remember called The Nation at Risk, or A Nation at Risk. And The Nation at Risk was a call to action saying, we have a rising tide of mediocrity. Our students are losing out, and international competitiveness, and something must be done. And it was an interesting time then to try to kind of rally. There was a coalition that was coming together on behalf of shifting this up, and some interesting theoretical ideas around, well, government really needs to kind of get out of the way of what educators know about their kids, and free up schools to do things differently and shift accountability from compliance to outcomes. That was a really compelling idea to me. And when I met Paul, he was, of course, trying to kind of lay those foundational aspects at the school district level by saying, well, maybe school boards should free up their schools and hold them accountable for results. We called it portfolio management. Many school districts have followed that route, and many to very, very good effect. But I think my reflection on that is that time was exciting. It was compelling, and in some ways very, very correct. We learned a lot about inequities in America by collecting data, starting to collect data and getting serious about it at the outcomes level. But there were some really serious unintended consequences by pushing accountability in a very simple way around simple outcomes. I think I contributed in my lending my voice to all this, to a narrowing of curriculum and forgetting about the other things that matter in schools, and thinking, well, if we measure outcomes, I think there was a lot of a naivete around, nobody really thought that if you just, said, hey, every kid should be able to read and compute, and that's all folks would focus on. I mean, there are lots of mistakes that were made, a lot, really. I think that the charter school movement, had very, very good outcomes for so many kids, but made serious mistakes along the way, didn't bring communities along in helping to determine what the schools would look like, for example. So that is all of that is part of what led us to this rethinking before the pandemic, is sort of like, okay, these big ideas are right. We have to make schools better. We have to bring a level of urgency to this. This matters for kids. It really matters whether they can get jobs and have happy lives and engage in civic dialogue and solve really wicked problems that are coming at our world and country. Really wicked problems, climate change, for example. We need this generation of kids to be the best generation, in my view. Generation A, Alpha is what they're called. We've been talking about them as the COVID generation, but I prefer the Gen A. We need them to be at their best, and so now is our chance. Now is our chance to right the wrongs of the past, but still maintain the urgency to make things better. That's the challenge.
Chris, I know you had a question.
So we didn't quite understand what we were getting into with silver lining for learning, but in a sense, we went fishing. We went fishing for people who were doing transformational things because the pandemic had weakened the dead hand of the past and the compliance mentality of the present. And so people were able to get away with doing transformational things. And in 133 episodes, I would say one thing we've learned is that many of the people that we've highlighted, no one knew about. They weren't at tech conferences. They weren't publishing in scholarly journals. Their lives are really centered on helping kids. And when the pandemic disrupted conventional ways of helping kids, because that was their primary goal, they invented ways of helping kids under the circumstances they found themselves. And I think it's a shame that other than our celebrating them, no one has gone through and identified this stellar group of people and praised them as a group. and looked at ways of drawing on their collective knowledge and experience, which is beyond the scope of what we're doing. But the other thing that I would say is that in every show we ask, do you have a model? Could the model be adapted for use elsewhere? Not adopted, but adapted as a way of going to scale. And again, most people hadn't really thought about what they were doing as a model, but a pretty substantial number of them had something that could be an adaptable model. And they also were not trying to be proprietary about it. They weren't trying to do a startup and say, I'm going to have a new chain of high-priced independent schools that uses my model. They were just trying to make a difference for as many people as they could. So in a sense, we have a naturalistic experiment that happened that we've been trying to document. And there should be some ways of taking advantage of that other than our having some wonderful case studies in multimedia archives to move forward with models and with people who are innovative enough to generate models. I don't know what your thinking is about that.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a lot of thoughts. I'm guessing Travis is just chomping at the bit to jump in. I'll just say briefly, completely agree. There's so much interesting work, so much interesting, important initiative going on out there that's yet uncaptured. And as a good researcher, I have to say, and yet unstudied, we need to learn more about these places and what they're doing or not doing on behalf of kids. And so we at SREPI have been doing a number of things on that front. One is we just have this set of case studies that I think Travis mentioned around the pods work. I think we have about a dozen of those. They're fascinating, really. And so just to go deep in some places that have done really important, really interesting work. We're also trying to go wide, however, and we have something called the Canopy Project. And that is a really fascinating work run by Chelsea Waite, one of our colleagues. Chelsea has been for several years now asking for nominations across the country, nominate a really innovative school. I think the nominations are still open. Do you know, Travis? Yeah, so please, the Canopy Project. We're taking the nominations, we do a little bit of vetting on them and a little bit of information and organize them so people can find them easily. And now Travis is doing adding to that work and has a similar kind of atlas of innovation, looking at innovations that are emerging outside the system that could be adopted inside. So what would you add, Travis?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would say is that another part of the next phase of our work is, models are one thing. I think the reality in public education is that there's another set of issues around barriers to adopting those models, political barriers to them taking hold, just systemic challenges. And so part of what our new phase of work is also working with organizations like Robin mentioned, the Oakland Reach, that are doing interesting and sort of game-changing work and starting to document not just the models, but their strategies for sort of building political power for families who haven't had it, and for overcoming sort of systemic barriers to change making that we know are a real factor in public education, and so that we can understand and sort of begin to codify what strategies are effective, how these barriers play out, and how groups are able to overcome them. Because I think that's a critical lens to bring to any kind of change making in public education.
Thank you. I know Kurt has another question, but I'm looking at the time. I just wanted you to talk. Firstly, congratulations on the big grant from the Wharton Foundation. Been following that. But one of the things that we have been working on together is around this Learning Futures Collaborative, and the piece that you guys are taking the lead on is sort of reimagining the new American high school. which is par for the course for ASU, because ASU is the new American university. So so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, or what sort of and you've already talked a little bit about what's coming up, that SREPI is going to be involved in going forward. Maybe briefly about that, then we can bounce back to Kurt and his question.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. The Walden Grant is exciting because it's going to allow us to support some districts as they try to adapt and adopt more innovation, which is so important right now. So we'll do our best on that front, and it'll give us the opportunity to have to commission research in really needed areas. So we're very, very thankful for that. The new American high school is, I'm really excited to have the opportunity with Learning Futures to talk with our ASU colleagues about how we can bring the expertise and research capacity of ASU to, I think, the heart of the innovation problem in public education. High schools have been so solidified in their approach for so long. They were designed, many, many years ago and have not changed for the most part, and are not working for too many kids. And I'd say that the area where most district leaders say they're interested in focusing their attention on innovation is high school. They know it's not working. Kids are telling us it's not working. They're telling us by dropping out, by being absent, by struggling with various academic or social dynamics, and the data bear it out. We are not preparing kids for college and career the way we should be. And Benny, I was talking a long time ago to my son. I had just learned about the Swiss model for preparing kids for career, and the apprenticeships that they've invested in, and just a much more flexible high school model where kids can have all these different pathways. And he said, of course that makes sense. I mean, why would you have one portal when kids are going off in so many different directions? Why would you do that? And I thought he put it so simply and well. And so with this work, we really hope to explore, what are the models out there that are really promising? But as Travis said, why is it that we can't get those models going faster? It's so urgent. It's so important. What would it take? So that's where we think interdisciplinary thinking, research, focused research is really going to make a difference. And we're excited to see where this will lead.
So,
thank you. Travis, anything to add before Kurt?
Yep.
I think that covered it beautifully. I think one thing I would say is also, thinking about just the post nation at risk reform playbook. One sort of thing that in federal school accountability policy is just that the standardized testing and the accountability for outcomes stops at 10th grade. And so there's almost this implicit signal in federal policy that 11th and 12th grade are kind of this netherworld. And so, I think that that gives us a blank canvas where we can really rethink, like, what does the experience look like for students in that range, where right now a lot of what they're getting is not relevant or not preparing them for the lives that they hope to lead.
Okay, so yeah, would you like to flag 2 or 3 reports, recent ones from SREPI, or ones that you're currently working on, that people who are watching the show again later might want to, or are watching it today, might want to tap into and read? Which are the ones that make you smile when you look at it? Oh, this is something to be proud of. And I'll go back to my earlier question about grants. What are some grant agencies that are funding things in this area that either you track, or you've been lucky enough, like Walden, to get some funding in, and so either of those two or both?
Sure. My top 3 reports, I think that, just make me smile, as you say. State of the American Student, where we put that out in September, and it was meant to, summarize where we are right now, but to lay the groundwork for where we want to go, urging people to set ambitious goals and setting some ideas about emerging innovations that can lead the pathway forward. That's one. Two is our pods research. We have Crisis Breeds Innovation, I believe is the title. That Travis, that was probably your title. That's a great report. It really lays out how educators, have loved teaching in smaller learning communities and all that rich data and experience. And then the last would be our series of 25th anniversary papers, Thinking Forward, which I think, I'd probably go back and we're 5 years in now. We've got to start working on our 30th. But and so things have changed. There's things that I'd change or rewrite, but I still think that the basic ideas hold and hopefully are provocative. And on funding, I mean, there are a list of national funders who are really interested in innovation and are coming at it from, of course, a lot of different perspectives. But I think the Walton Family Foundation, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the Barr Foundation in the Northeast is we're doing some work with them to track innovations there. Overdeck Foundation, and there are quite a few actually who are trying to think about how we can use this moment effectively. And best advice I can give is for folks seeking grant funding on that front is just be really clear about what your theory of action is and look for the overlap and find out some information about what the theory of action is that the foundation is using, and look for the overlap and talk to them, try to build relationships with them.
And I would just say one other education grant making initiative that I would say are studying is the Vela Education Fund, which is really making hundreds of really small bets, sometimes just a few $1,000s, on different sort of grassroots education efforts all over the country. And we are looking forward to studying a lot of those grantees and how does that play out more from the side of education entrepreneurs or people who are creating new solutions. They're testing a lot of things. Some of them might not work out, but others will. And so understanding, that's just an experiment that's happening on a grand scale with lots of small investments in a lot of small scale changes, some of which could wind up having a big impact. I'm not aware of anything else comparable to that in the education space, and it'll be worth seeing what impact that has.
So I was just wondering, we got about 3 minutes. So this is the end of the year. From the two of you, and I want to invite all my co-hosts to say, what would you wish to happen to public education? Just wish next year, something, just, beyond getting the money from Walton Foundation, just to say, what would you wish to happen next year? Just a big wish. Will not happen, but, just something big. Since Robin, we can start with you. Since you've been with this for 30 years, I just want to highlight the 30 years. Okay, so what do you think?
I wish we would zoom in on students who are most at risk right now in this moment, and also probably if they're most at risk, my guess is they also have in some ways the most potential to think differently, to contribute to a real diversity and real creativity in problem solving. Zoom in on those kids and start bringing it, just acting like we, it's a crisis, but it's also just an urgent opportunity to get things right for the kids who most need it and do right by Gen A. I just feel every day that I should be using every minute of my time figuring out how we can give those kids, that generation of kids, what they need, not because it's a moral question, it is, but we can't stop there. I really do believe they are our future. They will save this planet and they will make things right if we're going to do it.
Thank you, Travis.
My wish is that teaching rises to the level of prestige that matches that of doctors, where when students come home from the holidays and say, I'm studying to become an educator, their parents beam with pride. That's what I wish for.
Well, Punya, I would just want everybody a Happy New Year. Thank you. Happy New Year. Thank you so much.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
So we have to introduce the next show, I
Yep.
think. But did you have a wish, Punya?
No, I'm just, again, thank you, Robin and Travis, for joining us today. And this is, like I said, the last show of this year. So perfect, I think, ending to the year to have you guys over here. And I will be back in February. So I won't see you guys for a while. So happy New Year. And Kurt, tell us about what's happening on the 7th of January.
My wish is that they make silver lining into part of professional development for teachers and bring the guests that are fabulous like you all and create a giant MOOC out of it. Anyways, we're all at the end of the semester. Chris is probably, well, did you have classes? I think he had a class this semester. He's graded his papers. We've all graded our paper. And, often we assign something like the future of education. When we assign students to write a paper called the future of education, they'll say, I'll Google it. Well, our next show will actually have that happening because we're going to have Google for Education people here talking about their new report on the future of education. And in particular, they're going to focus on part 3, on the reimagining learning ecosystems. So my friend Jenny Majaria and her colleague Kimberly Lane Clark are going to be coming in from Google for Education on January 7th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Jenny has a book called Courageous Adventures that we might hear about as well. So I welcome you all to come in.